Hello, my name is Dr. Derek Sebree Jr. I'm a clinical psychologist within the state of Michigan and a core faculty member at the Michigan School of Psychology. And so today I'm happy to be here at the 2022 SHP conference. Um, and me and my research team of Carly Percy, Rebecca Jarvis, and Morgan Van Leer are going to be talking about our um, current research study that we just finished this last winter in relation to symbolic racism and climate change denial. So share my screen. So really thinking about these concepts of climate change, global warming, racism, and particularly as we move forward talking about symbolic racism, but really in the sense of where that's rooted in, the notion of anti-Black racism, particularly from my perspective as a Black American. And so really thinking these are two of the most environmentally detrimental crises that are impacting the US today, right? We know there's been summers, winters, there's been, growing seasons of just really dealing with season change as a result of climate change. The Eco America and APA Mental Health and Our Changing Climate report that recently came out has really highlighted that there are vast amounts of disparities when it comes to climate change and really just our approach to it. And as well as really starting to realize the amount of impact that climate change will have on mental health, right? Just from a variety of standpoints. But then really thinking also too that environmental justice and racial justice issues are often linked. Um, I think Shell et al. Really recently talking about doing a systemic review of the impact of systemic racism on biodiversity, for instance. So we know redlining areas tend to have lower amounts of biodiversity, lower amounts of green space, um, environmental zoning policies, and frontline communities dealing with environmental justice issues. Thinking of various Black American, indigenous communities, things like that. That where environmental zoning is often used as a way to place really undesirable structures in communities, whether that be, for instance, like the incinerator within Detroit, thinking of, just various like PVC plants and things like that, where really no one ever wants those kinds of things growing in their home, but it's a matter of who's not necessarily going to be able to fight back when we think of that. Right. And so then that also talks about legal policies that do not work for those in need. Right. And so thinking of the various policies, like within especially the last 5 years or so, where there's been a lot of things that have even sometimes been reversed for the purpose of allowing, increased amount of air pollution or environmental contaminants to be um, allowed in groundwater, in the air, in the soil, before saying that this is a toxic level. Right. And then thinking of other systems like mass incarceration, for instance. And as we know that, and we'll talk, I'll talk about in another presentation, but the idea that mass incarceration itself is also a driver of climate change, just based off of the amount of structural demands that prisons themselves place on environments. Right. And then thinking about how all of these are often also linked to race. Right. Thinking about how each of these, in my experience, have been involved within the Black American community, have been a large part of the Black American experience living within the United States. And so a research question is really thinking, okay, how are these processes maybe linked psychologically? Right? How are the ideas of climate change denial and anti-Black racism linked? Like we can see the data that says, well, there's links, but what does that really mean on a psychological level? Right, so then that brings me to talking about symbolic racism. And so thinking, Sears and Henry in 2003 had talked about anti or symbolic racism as being anti-Black affect is present and acknowledged, negative feelings towards Black people. And then this is similar to what we often hear of as implicit bias, being rooted in stereotype threat and also potentially proliferate stereotypes. Right, and so this idea of really, like what it says, affect, right? And so the affect of saying, there's also an emotional component here, right? Which I think, again, is what I kind of said, similar to maybe the implicit bias standpoint. So in that idea that, okay, there is an innate feeling of discomfort, towards somebody racially. Right, and the importance of this is the theory suggests that in the US, white American opposition to progressive racial policies is about more than just your political party affiliation. Right, and so thinking of a lot of climate change research has focused on like political ideologies and not necessarily party affiliation, but really focusing on, okay, we're looking at liberal versus conservative policies, right? And conservative ideologies versus liberal ideologies. Right, but this is, again, proposing a coherent belief system within the US. Right, like we're not saying this is a result of ignorance, this is a result of just the inability to understand or something. This is a coherent, intentional belief system. Right, and so thinking of symbolic racism, it embodies really 4 themes. So this idea of Blacks no longer facing much prejudice or discrimination, right? Black Americans no longer, or Black Americans' failure to progress as a result of not working hard enough. Black Americans demanding too much too fast. Right, and Blacks haven't gotten more than they deserve. Right, and so really these being, again, noticing that these are about ideologies or about notions of equity, equality, really, and thinking what is the basis of worth, right? And so really getting to, I think, some deeper constructs that often are housed within a lot of our political ideologies. Right, and so this combination of really looking at anti-Black affect, again, like really mentioning earlier, and then individualist values. Right, and so really the notion that, okay, everyone in the country should be able to, trudge forward, have their own rights, occupy the space that they want to and be the person they want to be, right? And so not necessarily, I guess the idea individualist values is not necessarily bad, but just individualist, right? As opposed to maybe collectivist, where you're looking at the good of the group in its whole. This may be looking at, okay, how does the individual live, right? What is the individual entitled to? Right, and this predisposes one to certain political beliefs and attitudes, right? And that's the idea of symbolic racism. And the theory goes to say that really, if people really house a lot of these ideologies, then they're more likely to go towards certain political beliefs and attitudes, right? Which I think is an important, again, we're talking about an attitudinal difference, right? And so social psych-wise, that's a huge impact on people's day-to-day behaviors, decisions. What are they more likely to endorse versus not endorse? Right, and so we look at it as a combination, again, of values and affect. Right, and so this idea of the fusion proposition, right, and so blending anti-Black affect with individualist traditional American conservative values, in one stance, but really thinking that is what creates this unique, notion with symbolic racism. Really, in that sense, because it's melding not just, oh, I don't like this person based off of, who they are, their heritage, the color of their skin, all of those pieces, but also the looking at, well, and this is how the system should work, right? And this is what I believe in. It tended to become somewhat problematic in research, right? Just because the blend was not really able to be defined specifically. And so there was a lot of criticism in the literature about symbolic racism being too non-specific, too abstract. And so you can really study, you can really define it. And so there became a problem in actually trying to, provide some backing to the theoretical basis. But as we know, also the theoretical underpinnings cannot be ignored. And so in the sense of racial animosity is part of white racial enactments and policy legislature, this requires specific work, right? And Sears and Henry have brought this up many times. And in 2003, they found that symbolic racism is a combination of racial prejudice and general conservatism, right? So again, there's that sense of, and conservatism generally, not saying conservatism necessarily in a specific sense of being maybe a conservative member of political party, right? But really saying general conservatism, right? And so this idea of wanting to conserve what is maybe in essence the idea of America, right? The American dream, right? So I think even in senses that goes just beyond the lines of liberal versus conservative at that point, because both, I think, house some sense of something wanting to conserve, wanting to protect. Right, and so this idea of a racialized individualism. And to be know, and so this is a quote from this Sears and Henry article in 2003. These findings suggest that symbolic racism is psychologically grounded to a significant degree, in a racialized individualism, a concern that Blacks do not live up to conventional individualistic values. On the face of it, this racialized individualism would seem to be a general psychological predisposition with little manifest political content or any direct link to political preferences. Symbolic racism, on the other hand, is an explicitly political belief system, expressing beliefs about Blacks' position both in the American social structure and in American politics. It seems therefore to form a primary cognitive linkage between racialized individualism and the political world. So it says opposition to liberal racial policies. Right, and so I'd say, yeah, liberal, like maybe more even progressive, right, in the sense of saying policies that are going to be about centering, in this particular sense, Black American groups to help uplift and, offset disparities. This is saying there's going to be direct opposition to that based off of really these ideas of racialized individualism and really cognitively, right, and linking those together. And then also the emotional affect of that, which is huge. Okay, and so thinking about climate change denial, study in 2020 really talked about this idea of looking at climate change denial alongside right-wing conservatism. Right, and this was within really European countries, so Sweden specifically. And so that is also a note, I think, to mind. This is really maybe more distinct for culturally, European culture. And so in the sense, participants in the study, there were over 3,000 participants in the study. So this is a big study. And so they were asked of how they might vote in an election for the parliament today, right? And so people stratifying based on political lines, and really finding that there's a large degree of distrust in media, social economic attitudes, anti-feminist attitudes, really having the strongest effects on that climate change denial, right? In the sense of really saying these are the things that really impacted people's likelihood to endorse higher amounts of denial versus lower. And so really looking at that alongside social dominance orientation. And it had a significant impact in terms of social dominance orientation, but also weak. Right, and so in that sense, it was not a huge impact. So really thinking social dominance wise, the belief that some groups just sit higher, have domain over others, right? And that was not a huge part of the climate change denial among radical right-wing supporters in Sweden. But really also noticing things like it correlated strongly with conservative ideologies, again, and as a result of that, looking at things like discriminatory views on immigration, opposition to multiculturalism and inclusive ideologies, anti-environmentalism. Right, and in this quote, it says, importantly, our results suggest that climate change denial is more consistently linked to the included attitudinal variables than to party support per se. This is from, July et al. 2020. Right, and so really thinking in the sense that we're also starting to see climate change denial being linked with some racially, or at least some racialized, belief system. Okay, and so here we have for the focus of the research, we're looking at the utilization of 4 scales. So the social dominance orientation scale, the climate change denial scale, the symbolic racism scale, and the white racial affect scale. So rationale, given the corollaries and links between climate change denial and anti-progressive views mixed with conservative ideology, looking at what informs these conservative ideologies. And so looking at symbolic racism scale and white racial affect scale, maybe to speak more to affective components, such as underlying feelings towards groups, as opposed to looking at more political ideologies and cognitive standpoints. And so next, and that concludes this next part. And so for up next, we will have our method section, which will be taken over by our research team. And so first up will be Carly Percy.
As far as procedures, the survey was conducted through SurveyMonkey. So we emailed or posted a link to the study through the various platforms mentioned before, which included being directed to an informed consent page. And then once participants completed the informed consent and volunteered to participate in the study, we directed them to the questionnaire, which began with demographic information. So for the purposes of this study, we only collected age and ethnic racial identity to screen for inclusion criteria. For the questionnaires, as mentioned before, these were done through SurveyMonkey. All of the question items or the survey items were randomized, so there was no particular order. And the scales that we used were the white racial affect scale, the social dominance scale, the symbolic racism scale, and the climate change denial scale, which will be talked about in more detail a little bit later. And then once the questionnaire was completed, the participants were sent to a debriefing and thank you page where we just explained the purpose of the study and thank them for participation. And then for the analysis, like mentioned before, we originally planned to do an explanatory method with some specific hypotheses around how these different scales and these different phenomena were related, but because there is not a lot of research on that, we chose to do an exploratory cluster analysis. So for a cluster analysis, the main purpose of it is to partition data into several groups so that objects, in our cases, responses, belonging to the same cluster are similar, and objects or responses belonging to different clusters are dissimilar. So essentially it lumps the data in terms of what responses were the most closely related to one another. And for the purposes of this study, I believe we came up with two, which will be discussed in more detail later. Our goal for the study was to attempt to understand how climate change denial, social dominance, and symbolic racism inform one another. And we discovered that the best way, or identified that the best way to do this was through a cluster analysis to kind of give us an idea of the way that people responded and how those things interacted with one another. And so now we'll go into detail about the specific scales and some of the example items that we used, and talk a little bit about validity of those scales.
Yes, so on to one of the scales that Carly had mentioned is the white racial affect scale. And so the study that utilized the development of this scale was, they were kind of trying to assess how both white guilt and shame were seen in a scenario-based format, while also accounting for associated processes of detachment and externalization of blame. And so the main scale constructs for this were white guilt, white shame, and negation, which actually combines externalization of blame and detachment. And so just to kind of define what these are, white guilt is the negative self-conscious emotion that white people may feel about behaviors or attitudes, as well as contemporary or historical injustices perceived as racist. White shame is then a more painful form of negative self-conscious affect than white guilt. And it's really directed towards the self. And then negation, like I said, was the combination of detachment and externalization of blame. And so detachment really describes the resistance expressed by white people when they refuse to acknowledge an issue or controversy that has anything to do with race or structural inequity, while externalization of blame denotes the cognitive and affective strategies taken by white people who place blame and responsibility of these two constructs, or the responsibility of injustice or controversy on others. And so when they created this scale, they were trying to actually keep the externalization of blame and the detachment separate, but they loaded together and then created the negation construct. And so they conducted a exploratory factor analysis with this scale, and all of the Cronbach's alphas were above 0.70, which is really good and shows good construct validity and internal reliability. And they also conducted a confirmatory factor analysis, which showed the test-retest reliability was high across all of the subscales, and each administration of the factors were significantly correlated at alpha levels less than 0.01. So again, just showing this overall good validity and reliability of the scale. And so because this scale was a scenario-based format, I'm going to read the instructions for the scale, or for each of the items, because it's a little bit different than just answering one statement. And so the instructions for the items say, below are situations that people are likely to encounter in day-to-day life, followed by several common reactions to these situations. As you read each scenario, try to imagine yourself in that situation, then indicate how likely you would be to react in each of the ways described. We ask that you rate all of the responses because people may feel or react more than one way to the same situation. or they may react in different ways at different times. And so on the side, I have an item example. And so the scenario is kind of says this: you read a news story about white students at a large private university dressing in blackface for a theme party. And so then the reactions are below. You would think, that's so awful. I hope they have to face consequences for their behavior. And then you answer, not likely to very likely, and how you feel about that. The next reaction is you would wish you weren't white. And then again, you answer on that not likely to very likely scale. And the same thing, you would think, I'm sure the students didn't mean any harm. And again, answer that way. So that's how all of the items are on this scale. And so it's a very interesting way to get at these pieces of white guilt, shame, and negation. And then the next scale that I'm going to talk about is the symbolic racism scale. And so, as kind of mentioned earlier on, symbolic racism is based on these beliefs that are broken down into these 4 specific themes, which are the main constructs of the scale. So that of Black people no longer face much prejudice or discrimination. So this denial area. Black people's failure to progress results from their unwillingness to work hard enough, so that they should work harder. Black people are demanding too much too fast, so that demands for special favors. And then the last one, Black people have gotten more than they deserve, so these undeserved outcomes. So it really falls in line with how symbolic racism is defined, and the scale breaks down the constructs in just that same way. And in the article that originated from this scale, they talk about breaking down symbolic racism and the terms. And so in this study, they talk about the term racism reflects the hypothesis that symbolic racism includes underlying prejudice towards Black individuals. And then the term symbolic highlights both symbolic racism's targeting of Black people as an abstract collectivity rather than specific Black individuals, and that its presumed roots are in abstract moral values rather than concrete self-interest or personal experience. So it's this more broad overarching view. And symbolic racism has also been labeled modern racism or subtle racism because it has this less overt nature to it. And then the exploratory factor analysis that was conducted for this scale showed Cronbach's alphas of 0.70 and 0.80. So again, they're very, very strong for this. And then I actually believe that the highest Cronbach's alpha was 0.86. So some of them were very, very strong. And then the confirmatory factor analysis confirmed all of the factors as well. So again, it's overall seen as very strong in terms of reliability and validity with the analysis conducted, and the dominant finding was that is very internally consistent and a unitary construct. And kind of to break down each of the constructs and some of the item examples. On the side, we have, kind of what one would look like is a statement falling under one of these constructs, and then there would be an answer based on a Likert scale. So in the denial of continuing racial discrimination construct, some of the examples for an item on this scale would be generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Blacks to work their way out of the lower class. Or discrimination against Blacks is no longer a problem in the United States. So those are 2 item examples from that scale. In terms of the Black should work harder scale, some examples are, it's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If Blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. Or Blacks work just as hard to get ahead as most other Americans. So that kind of it gets at what these scales are getting at. And then the demands for special favors scale, some examples of this are Blacks are getting too demanding in their push for equal rights, or Blacks generally do not complain as much as they should about their situation in society. And lastly, for the undeserved outcomes scale or construct, an example from an item underneath this one is, over the past few years, Blacks have gotten less than they deserve. So pretty straightforward, but I just wanted to give some examples of how these statements are really getting at what these constructs of symbolic racism are. And, you know, they're answered similarly on this extremely opposed to extremely favor on this Likert scale format. And then we'll go on to the other scales.
So the next scale that we use is the social dominance scale. And this is a single construct. It's 14 item scale that measures like just for social dominance orientation. Social dominance orientation is the degree to which an individual's like their preference for inequality among social groups. So basically, it's the extent to which the individual wants the group that they're in to be like superior to outgroups. And this scale is based off social dominance theory, which believes that individuals who are more social dominance oriented will favor policies and ideologies that are more hierarchy enhancing, whereas individuals with lower social dominance orientation favor hierarchy constricting policies and ideologies. So for the exploratory factor analysis, the alpha showed 0.83 and showed good internal reliability across all the samples. It was also shown that all the items were highly correlated with the remainder of the scale in every sample. And so for the CFA, they used sample 2, which was a participant size of 446. And with this sample, they used a maximum likelihood estimation in order to test the model in which all 14 items on the scale were like driven by a single construct. And they found that each item had a statistically significant relationship to the factors, suggesting that the 14 item scale like does what it is intended to do, and it measures a unitary construct. And so it, like I mentioned, it had good internal reliability and was a unitary construct. And because of like how well the 14 item scale worked out, they have created a shorter social dominance scale that is only 4 questions, and it measures social dominance orientation as well. So the item example for this, so items on this scale measure the belief that some people are inherently superior or inferior to others. Items were balanced so that half of the items indicated approval of inequality and the other half indicated approval of equality. So for example, in one of the questions is, in setting priorities, we must consider all groups. So then they would answer like 1 through 5, 1 is extremely opposed and 5 is extremely favor. And since the scale is so short, I'll just kind of read the other 3. So the other 3 items on the scale are, we should not push for group equality. Group equality should be our ideal, and superior groups should dominate inferior groups. So the last scale that we used was the climate change denial scale. This was a single construct as well. And it's a 16 item scale that measures different forms of climate change denial. So such as like denial of human effect and denial of seriousness. So how much do people believe that humans have something to do with climate change, or how serious do they believe climate change is? And research shows that like right-wing populists tend to dismiss climate change more so, despite like scientific evidence stating otherwise. Research hasn't studied like the explanation for this, or like what causes like more right-wing populists to believe this. So hence the creation of this scale, like how does climate change play in with social dominance, for example. That is the key ideology variable within predicting climate change denial. So for the exploratory factor analysis, the factor analysis conducted the alphas at 0.84. They did not do a confirmatory factor analysis in this study, or it wasn't reported, but there was an overall like reliability. They did retest reliability. So, and then the items on this one, basically pretty much the same as the previous scale. one of the items says, I find it hard to believe that the Earth's climate is really changing. And then they would answer 1 through 5, 1 being extremely opposed, 5 being extremely favor. And there is a shorter version of this scale as well. And it is 5 questions. So I'll just go ahead and read the other 4. So they say the temperature on Earth varies naturally and human activity has nothing to do with this variation. My opinion is that we will not even notice the effects of climate change. The so-called climate threat is exaggerated, and I believe that there is enough scientific evidence to confirm the changes in Earth's climate.
We're going to finish out with going over the results of the study. So really getting, to the exciting part about the really what did we find? Okay, and so I guess really I would start with saying, really maybe talking also about the process. And so really the data collection process was, like mentioned really over social media. I did find that as I was going through social media advertising, really getting, I think, a lot of animosity about like the questions. Really even sometimes getting messages, like I know through Reddit, getting messages of folks being a little bit kind of upset about it. Really feeling, I think sometimes kind of called out by the questions, really criticizing a lot of the questions and what they were even asking. And so really noticing that there was even a lot of reaction, I think, just through the instruments themselves. And so I think that's always important to note. And so continuing forward and talking about the data analysis. So for the data analysis, so we really looking at the exploratory model, we decided really looking at hierarchical cluster analysis and just going through the process of, okay, and so if we're talking about cluster analysis, how do we find the number of clusters? How do we find the number, what is actually applicable to what kinds of groupings do we have? Right, and so hierarchical cluster analysis, it runs the data through successive iterations to find, okay, essentially what are the cluster centers, right? And then how far apart are these cluster centers from each other? How much overlap is there? And so through the process, it determined really that there were 2 clusters of membership, which is rather common. Typically 2 clusters are more, you tend to get a better stratification of differences between the clusters as opposed to sometimes having more clusters. And so in terms of iterations, as you see here, so iterations is really the computations have to run through so many iterations of trying to find, okay, how much do we have to do in order to say that there are 2 cluster centers, right? And so through computing that, and through 3 iterations of computing that, it was able to decide, okay, based on these groupings, we're not seeing any successive difference between things and so we can say within those 3 computations that it determined there was 2 clusters. Right, and it's found that really the minimum distance between those clusters was at least 12, right? So 12 in terms of really thinking like deviations from that center. Right, which is pretty big, just because there was a large amount of difference, and as we'll talk, really between the 2 clusters. And so when we tried to initially compute it with 3 clusters, it did not create distinctive clusters. And so what that really means is by looking at the clusters, really there was overlap between 1, 2, and 3 at that point. So really kind of thinking maybe of Venn diagram. So 2 was kind of in the middle, 1 and 2 are kind of overlapping that. Right, and so the 2 cluster model held the most stability. and N was small. And so you'll see as I kind of go through the slides, N was about 137. So, rather small sample size in that way, but also the clusters were very distinct. Okay, so looking at final cluster center. So after all those computations, iterations, it says based on people's scores in each of these categories. So, so the first being SDF means social dominance scale, CCD is climate change denial, SR symbolic racism, and then symbolic racism was actually broken up into the various, really looking at the various constructs within it. Right, so a lot of what we had talked about earlier and in the beginning, if you remember when I talked about the 4 themes within symbolic racism, each of these speak into those 4 themes, right? So, denial of that difference and of that racism, the denial of, and really thinking of Black Americans as not working hard. Thinking of demanding too many favors, right? And so trying to take too much, right? Asking for too much, and then underserved outcomes, right? Saying there is no difference, so everyone is equal there. And then also looking at the white racial affect scale, right? And so, as Rebecca talked about earlier, looking at the negation, right, and the guilt and the shame, right, constructs on that scale, and really seeing, okay, how does racial affect actually play into that too, right? And so the cluster centers each really illustrated that if we think of one cluster as, okay, here's one circle over here and another cluster over here, you want them to be as far apart as possible, right? Because then that's really saying this group membership is much different than this group's membership. Right, and so really seeing across some of these, so social dominance scale was a rather small one in terms of difference. But then you start to see climate change denial, it's much bigger, kind of getting into like 1 point of difference. Looking at symbolic racism, and this being standardized by disease scores, right? And so looking at more than 1 point of difference. Right, and so almost getting like looking at 2 and beyond in some cases, right? And so underserved outcomes even being large, right? And all of them, negation being very large, guilt also very large, right? And guilt we'll talk a little bit more about later because that came back with some interesting findings. But then as a result of that, shame itself also really have a rather small difference. Right, so this is saying really folks who fell into cluster 1 really fell into endorsing more progressive ideologies with regard to climate change denial. So really addressing like lower scores on climate change denial, right? And really talking about in the so not even quite a standard deviation in the other direction. And same thing with denial, working harder, demand favors, underserved outcomes, negation, but then guilt it actually is kind of trending towards in the positive direction, right? As opposed to everything else kind of rather being in a negative, right? With the exception of the social dominance, right? And then cluster 2 being much more starkly folks endorsing higher degrees of scores on climate change denial scale, right? And so endorsing higher amounts of denial, endorsing higher amounts of ideologies in relation to symbolic racism, and endorsing much lower degrees of guilt, right? And so this is really what makes up the distinction thinking between these 2 clusters. Right, so again, looking at the iteration history, right, and then looking at the number of cases in these clusters. So really this way with clusters, you really want less, because the more you have, the more you're spreading people out across clusters, and potentially less emphasis there is in of those clusters. Right, and so here you see cluster one, a large majority of the people really fell into cluster one. Whereas large majority of folks in cluster two were really the ones endorsing these higher amounts of, again, symbolic racism, climate change denial, but then the number is much lower in terms of membership. Right, and so thinking of the 137 cases that we had, really 96% were complete. And then about 29%, 30% of them were missing some pieces, right? So having some missing data. And so still within a parameter of being able to still work with the data and be able to just kind of describe some things that we're seeing at that point. Okay. So then thinking otherwise, thinking also age. And so like mentioned earlier, predominant amount of age was really 25 to 44. And so really those age ranges, that making up really about 50, almost about 50% of the actual demographics of the study. And so, white Americans age 25 to 44, really followed by next 18 to 44, right? Which I think often accounts for also, so really seeing at that point, just somewhat of a positive skew, but really I think that is also in relation to the way in which recruitment was done, a lot of it being over the internet, through social media, right? And so really having a lot of younger folks who are really engaging in using, different aspects of social media, and then also different aspects of technology with this. Right, so then here's another illustration of age. Right, and so this I think is interesting depiction. So this is really tried to cluster the actual like a bar graph of, if we're looking at again these relationships and these memberships in these two clusters, what does this really look like illustrated differently? Right, and so seeing really cluster one kind of toying really, I'd say the middle line, and really kind of just, I think endorsing more ideologies that you might say are anti-racist, in favor of addressing climate change, and those ideas about it. And then cluster two really being staunchly opposed to those pieces, so really higher degrees of climate change denial, higher degrees of symbolic racist ideologies, lower degrees of guilt as a result. Whereas cluster one has a little bit of guilt, right? A little bit, but still much more than cluster two. And cluster two is much more in the opposite direction. And so thinking, really looking at the ANOVA sum of squares, and really looking at the F scores. So of the F scores, the ones that really stood out are, again, looking at the symbolic racism pieces in relation with the climate change denial, social dominance orientation, and really the scale totals from that didn't really come back as significant. Meanwhile, climate change denial did, although having a smaller F. Meanwhile, symbolic racism, so denial, having the highest, really on the whole measure of in this whole project. And so seeing that really had some of the strongest impact on membership with these groups of folks having higher degrees of symbolic racism were the ones that were showing up in a different cluster. Right, and so then seeing as we go down the list, work harder is at 162, so again, very close. And then it continues to kind of decrease from there. So demand favors at 137, underserved outcomes right? And then all of those still being statistically significant, right? And then also negation and guilt again, right? Guilt being probably the next lowest as opposed to climate change denial, whereas negation is much higher. And then shame itself again, not really showing up. Right? Shame not statistically significant in this, not really a key aspect of determining membership between these clusters. Right, and so it's a part of that, then looking at, okay, so what if we start to look at maybe start to explore some of those relationships between what we're seeing here. Right, and so we decided to do some, just some Pearson's R correlational tables to kind of see, and then also doing some graphs to illustrate. And so here on the y-axis, you have climate change denial, and on the x-axis, you have the work harder totals, right? Totals from the scales, the z-scores, right? And seeing that really as climate change denial totals went up, so did work harder totals, right? And so seeing maybe a positive correlation there between the denial of climate change and then the idea of Black Americans not working as hard as they could, right? And just different ideologies like that. And then the correlation, the coefficient at 0.282. Right, and so then looking at, again, climate change denial on the y-axis, then looking at demand favors. Right, and so, okay, asking too much, really trying to get ahead, but, not really needing that, and really should be okay with where you are. You should be okay with where you are. And so seeing here again, another positive correlation, right? So as climate change denial totals go up, so do demand favor totals. And then the R squared here was 0.261. Great, and so here we also see, again, climate change denial on the y-axis, and then looking at underserved outcomes. Right, so again, seeing there's also a correlation there. Right, and this time the R squared is 0.217. So as you can see, kind of going down. Right, and then looking at, again, climate change denial, and looking at white racial affect in terms of negation subscale totals, and so 0.211, but again, another positive correlation. Right, so as those totals go up on climate change denial, so do those aspects of really endorsing pieces related to negation of experience, negation of discomfort, right, and the white racial affect. And then here, seeing that this was the interesting one to me, looking at climate change denial, looking at the white racial guilt subscale totals, and there being actually an inverse relationship, right? And so this goes back to really what you were seeing in the tables and the bar chart, right? And so seeing that as totals went up in climate change denial, the totals in terms of guilt went down, right? And so I think that's an important really phenomenon that really needs to continue to be talked about and is not explored. Right? In the sense of saying folks in cluster 2 have way less guilt racially than folks in cluster 1. Right? And so then this is, pieces to continue thinking about. If we're talking about psychological processes, this is an important link. Right, and then also looking at climate change denial and the symbolic racism denial subscale. And so the R squared 0.156, so lower than the others, but also then again, still a positive relationship. Right, and so looking at the correlation of saying as climate change denial totals went up, so did symbolic racism with denial totals. Right, and so then this, looking at again, this was the upscale from earlier, right? So just illustrate it differently again. But again, still that same notion of now seeing there is a large degree of focus on symbolic racism. Really with regard also when we're talking about climate change. And then white racial affect kind of being being part of that process in there too somewhere. Okay, and so this is the correlation table, right? It's a pretty big table. And so really looking at this, we see that the top row is the climate change denial, right? So these are all the Pearson correlation totals, right? So seeing along the top, the significance really shows up if we're talking about climate change denial with, again, the work harder totals, demand favors, underserved outcomes, negation, and guilt. Right, and then we also see denial as also having statistical significance, but a little lower. And then still the social dominance scale also having correlation. Right, and then looking at the guilt subscale, we also see it having an inverse relationship with the symbolic racism scale, right? And so seeing inverse relationship with guilt as far as work harder totals, as far as demand favor totals, and as far as underserved outcomes, right? And then even higher as a result of negation. Right, so that sense, the more someone negates, the less guilt they're gonna have. Right, I mean, that makes sense because it's part of the subscale, but also thinking here, within regards to symbolic racism and white racial affect, I mean, that's we're seeing that those scales also have some correlation with each other. So maybe similar aspects, but not quite the same constructs, right? Which is important for us in terms of really trying to look at, a comprehensive or as much of a view with regards to racial ideologies and psychological processes and climate change denial. Okay, so think about key takeaways with this. Really between two distinct clusters, endorsement of symbolic racist ideologies and climate change denial really determine cluster membership, right? So if we're thinking about those ideologies, but we're also thinking about affect, right, too, in there, then we're seeing guilt, negation, and symbolic racism really having a huge interplay with when we're talking about climate change denial in terms of the membership with these folks between these two clusters. So, right, white guilt seems to have an inverse relationship to climate change denial. And white negation correlates pretty well with climate change denial. Right, and so this idea of, okay, maybe that's not, oh, that's not happening. I can minimize it. I can push these pieces down. Right, and these endorsements came from a variety of age groups of white Americans. Right, and this is important. Really thinking about how in the United States, there are specific cultural experiences, specific cultural history lends itself to particular socio-cultural, socio-psychological perspectives and ideologies, and then as a result, different actions, right? Different behaviors that come across. Right, and so we're looking at racial affect potentially correlating in a sense with attitudes towards climate change, really looking at these cluster pieces and this analysis, saying that this might be here, right? And so really, again, more work needs to be done to really start to investigate the potentiality of this. Right, and so racial guilt may have a role in the endorsement of those symbolic racial ideologies. Right, so again, thinking about that anti-Black affect, right, like mentioned earlier, in terms of really part of that construct when it comes to symbolic racism. Well, what if we're saying, well, guilt being a part of affect, right? And so express guilt being important in this mix somewhere, right? And that is huge, right? If we're thinking in terms of research and as far as what we know psychologically, clinically, guilt, but although not shame, right? Shame is not really in there, although shame might be more of a, as we know, more of a stop all, right? And so now folks aren't necessarily even going the extra step with that. Whereas guilt, there's a difference there. Right, so again, more research is needed to further investigate these relationships. You know, the exploratory analysis has really given way, I think, to some interesting areas for future research, future inquiry. Yeah, and hopefully as time goes on, I'll be happy to come back and present maybe some more things with folks in future events, future conferences. And so if folks have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to me at my email. So that's DSEBREE, like D Sebree, at msp.edu. And thank you all for taking this time to sit with us and watch our presentation. And I hope folks enjoy the rest of the conference.